Sarah Whitfield had exactly 47 minutes left on the clock, and she intended to spend every one of them the same way she had spent the last 6 years. Quietly, carefully, and without drawing a single ounce of attention to herself. The fluorescent lights of Ward 4B hummed their familiar tune overhead as she moved from room to room, checking for drips, adjusting pillows, and murmuring reassurances to patients who trusted her more than they trusted most doctors. To everyone in this hospital, she was simply Nurse Whitfield, competent, soft-spoken, always the first to volunteer for a double shift and the last to ask for credit. Nobody knew that 6 years ago, before the scrubs and the stethoscope, she had worn a different uniform entirely. She had built her new life brick by brick, day by day, in this unremarkable regional hospital tucked into a town most people couldn't find on a map. That was the point. Obscurity was armor. After what happened during her final deployment, the operation that still occasionally surfaced in her nightmares, the one that had earned her a citation she was never allowed to display and a target she was never allowed to acknowledge, she had walked away from that world entirely. She had a new name on her badge, though it wasn't really new. It was simply the name she'd been born with, the one that had been buried under call signs and clearance levels for the better part of a decade. Sarah. Just Sarah. A woman who liked to garden on weekends, who kept a photo of her golden retriever taped inside her locker, who flinched only slightly when a car backfired outside the hospital. That morning had been ordinary, which was exactly how she liked it. A minor fracture in room 12, a stubborn fever in room 15, an elderly man in room 9 who told the same joke about his fishing trip every single day, and she laughed every single time because it clearly meant the world to him. She'd charted her notes, restocked the supply cart, and was mentally already halfway through her drive home, imagining the quiet of her small apartment and the dog waiting by the door. 6 years of building something normal. 6 years of being nobody in particular. And in 47 minutes it would all still be true. Or so she believed. The first sign that something was wrong was the silence. Ward 4B was never silent. There was always a monitor beeping, a cartwheel squeaking, a television murmuring from some patient's room. But as Sarah rounded the corner near the nurse's station, the ordinary chaos seemed to fold in on itself. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A resident physician froze with a chart in his hand, staring past her down the hallway. Sarah followed his gaze and felt something cold settle low in her stomach, an old and familiar sensation she hadn't experienced in years but recognized instantly. The way you recognize the sound of your own name shouted across a crowded room. 4 men in full tactical gear were walking through the hospital corridor. Not hospital security. Not local police in body armor overreacting to some drill. These were operators. She knew the gait, the way they scanned a room without appearing to scan it, the economy of movement that civilians mistook for casualness but was actually the product of thousands of hours of training. Their patches were subdued, their weapons holstered but present, and the man at the front carried himself with the unmistakable weight of command. Every nurse, every doctor, every visitor in that hallway pressed themselves against the walls, unsure whether to be afraid or simply confused. Sarah's hand instinctively drifted toward her ID badge, an old reflex from a life she thought she'd left behind, checking that her cover was intact even though she knew, somehow with sickening certainty, that whatever was happening had nothing to do with badges. The lead operator's eyes swept the corridor once, twice, and then locked onto her. Not on the doctors. Not on the nurse's station. On her. Sarah felt her pulse spike in a way it hadn't in years, a purely physical response that bypassed her carefully constructed civilian composure entirely. She had trained herself to control that reaction, to breathe through it, to let nothing show on her face. But some part of her, the part that had once made split-second decisions with other people's lives in her hands, recognized in that man's posture a specific kind of urgency. This wasn't a random security sweep. This wasn't a mistake. This was a team that had been given an objective, and the objective was standing in Ward 4B in blue scrubs with a stethoscope around her neck. He stopped 3 feet in front of her, and up close she could see the exhaustion behind his eyes, the kind that came from a mission that hadn't gone according to plan. The other 3 fanned out slightly behind him, not threatening but positioned. She recognized the formation instantly, a protective triangle, the kind you formed around someone important or something important, or someone you were about to ask for something you desperately needed. The hallway had gone utterly silent now, every staff member and patient within earshot frozen in place, waiting to see what four heavily armed soldiers wanted with their quiet, unassuming nurse. "Ma'am," the lead operator said, his voice low but carrying, steady in a way that suggested he had rehearsed this moment during the entire drive to the hospital. "We need your help. We were told you were the only one who could do this." Sarah felt every eye in the corridor turn toward her, felt the weight of 6 years of careful anonymity crack down the middle in a single sentence. A resident physician behind her whispered something to a colleague, the word "ma'am" clearly striking them as strange, formal, almost military in its precision because it was. Because for 6 years nobody had called her that. Nobody was supposed to know there was a reason to. Sarah looked past the lead operator to the man's team, then back to his face, and in that instant she understood that whatever quiet life she had built for herself in this hospital was about to be interrupted by the very past she had worked so hard to bury. She swallowed hard, feeling the old instincts rise up through 6 years of dormancy like something that had never actually left, only slept. "What happened?" she said, and it wasn't really a question. It was the voice of someone who already knew the answer would change everything. The lead operator, whose name patch read Reyes, glanced once at the crowded hallway before speaking again, and Sarah understood the unspoken request immediately. This conversation needed privacy. She led the team into the empty consultation room at the end of the corridor, aware of dozens of eyes following the procession, aware that by tomorrow the entire hospital would be buzzing with theories about the quiet nurse and the soldiers who called her ma'am, like she outranked a general. She closed the door behind them and turned to face 4 men who suddenly looked less like an armed unit, and more like exhausted people running out of options. "There's a situation," Reyes said, pulling a tablet from a pouch on his vest and turning the screen toward her. "Overseas. A joint operation went sideways 6 hours ago. We have a team pinned down, and one of our own is critical. Gunshot wound, field medic did what he could, but he's not stable enough to move, and we don't have the surgical capability on site to keep him alive much longer." He paused, watching her face carefully, as though gauging exactly how much of the old Sarah remained beneath the scrubs. "The extraction window is narrow. We need someone with trauma surgery experience who's also cleared for the classification level of this operation. Someone who can be briefed and moving within the hour. Your name came up." Sarah felt the room tilt slightly, not from surprise at the request itself, but from the specific surgical way. It had been delivered. Someone had pulled her file. Someone had cross-referenced medical credentials against security clearances that were supposed to have been sealed the day she resigned. "My clearance was revoked when I separated," she said carefully, testing the boundaries of what they actually knew. "Reactivated 4 hours ago," said the operator behind Reyes, a woman with sergeant's stripes and eyes that missed nothing. "Direct order. We were told if anyone could stabilize him in the field and get him through extraction, it was you. They said you'd done it before. Kandahar, they said. They didn't need to say more than that." The mention of Kandahar hit Sarah like a physical blow, dragging up a memory she had spent 6 years trying to sand down into something bearable. The worst night of her career. The night she had operated on a fellow soldier by flashlight in the back of a transport vehicle, while the sound of gunfire provided percussion to her sutures. The night she had saved a life everyone else had already begun mourning. She had never spoken of it to anyone in her civilian life. Her co-workers here knew her as a competent ER nurse with steady hands and a calm bedside manner. None of them knew those hands had once held a man's heart rate steady through sheer force of will, while chaos exploded around her. "I'm not that person anymore," Sarah said, though even as the words left her mouth, she recognized the lie for what it was. The dog-eared photo in her locker, the quiet apartment, the garden, none of that had erased 6 years of training, 6 years of instinct, 6 years of knowing exactly what to do when someone's life was measured in minutes. It had only buried it. Reyes stepped closer, lowering his voice, and something in his expression softened from military urgency into something more human, more desperate. "His name is Corporal Daniel Ortiz, 26 years old. He has a little girl waiting for him at home who just turned 4 last week. I watched him carry 2 wounded men out of a collapsed building under fire 8 months ago, and I'm not going to stand here and watch him die because we couldn't find the one person capable of keeping him alive long enough to get him to a real hospital." He held her gaze steadily. "I know what we're asking. I know you built a life here specifically to get away from all of this. But I wouldn't be standing in this hallway if there was any other option. Sarah looked at the tablet screen again, at the grainy field footage of a young man surrounded by medics who were doing everything they could with equipment that wasn't nearly enough, and felt the last of her carefully constructed civilian identity dissolve. She thought of her golden retriever waiting by the apartment door, of the quiet Tuesday evening she had promised herself, of the ordinary life she had fought so hard to build. And then she thought of a 4-year-old girl who might grow up without a father because the system had, for once, actually gotten something right and found the one person qualified to prevent that. I need my old field kit, Sarah said, already moving toward the door, her voice shifting into something crisper, more commanding, a register her hospital colleagues had never once heard from her. The one in secure storage if it still exists. And I need a briefing en route, not here, we're wasting daylight. She paused at the doorway and looked back at the 4 operators who had just watched a quiet nurse transform, in the space of 30 seconds, into someone who had clearly done this before. And somebody needs to call my supervisor and tell her I'm taking emergency leave. Effective immediately. Reyes allowed himself the smallest hint of a relieved smile as the team fell into motion around her, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had just watched a plan come together. As they moved back through the hospital corridor, Sarah now walking at the center of the formation instead of alongside it, the protective triangle reshaping itself around her without a word being spoken. Every nurse, doctor, and patient who had witnessed the earlier confrontation watched in stunned silence as the woman they thought they knew disappeared through the sliding doors flanked by 4 soldiers who clearly considered her the most important person in the building. Nobody in that hospital would ever look at Nurse Whitfield the same way again. And somewhere on the other side of the world, a young corporal with a 4-year-old daughter had just gained the one chance he needed to make it home. If this story moved you, made your heart race, or reminded you that everyday people can carry extraordinary pasts, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because stories like Sarah's are exactly what this channel was built to tell, and you won't want to miss the next one.